Earlier, when talked about the triggering point for transitioning from one phase to next, your answer for the first one was really good. A few indicators you should look for to make that transition. What is the indicators for the second transition from phase two to phase three?
Yeah, so the phase two to phase three transition. So in phase two, we had moved to teams, and a lot of that was because we didn't have consistent ownership over products, right? So we moved to mission-based team models, which kind of solves some of the problems of long-term ownership, stable interfaces, and teams being able to balance feature development versus long-term foundations. But there's still some challenges with this model, and so some of the challenges, ecosystem is developing really quickly. So there's going to be inbound needs that don't clearly map to any of the existing teams. And now that you're in this team-based structure, you're starting to sort of optimize your roadmaps locally within the missions of your teams. But then you see these cross-cutting needs or these needs that aren't covered. So inevitably, you end up layering on this system of global prioritization on top of the local prioritization. And one of the failure modes that we kind of started seeing over and over is we get through quarterly planning, and then a need would kind of come in that was cross-cutting, and we inevitably had to ask teams to deprioritize stuff on their roadmap to fund these projects. Plaid is very good about thinking about global impact, so it wasn't hard to do. But what it means is that it stopped teams from making really long-term investments in foundations or taking on longer-term big bets that would span multiple quarters, because this was sort of happening every quarter. And then because this is happening, it still requires high coordination costs, right? Like many teams have to talk. You have to get all the managers in a room and make some of these trade-offs. And so you're kind of back to the point where like your coordination costs are almost exponential with your number of teams, right? So then you start to see velocity slowing down because of these bottlenecks, right? And the coordination cost to resolve these bottlenecks is super costly. So some of the like measurable things you might see where you're like, okay, I think we're clearly on track to go to the next phase is, how many products require changes to the same underlying systems, and how many conversations does that take to resolve? Are there many teams building the same types of logic? So we started to run into cases, as we got to 20 or 30 teams, where some of the communication wasn't scaling, and many teams are thinking about, oh, we need to add text messaging infrastructure. There's no platform to do that. Let me just build this for my feature. And then, I think the velocity angle, are we starting to realize impact of projects too slowly? So if you kind of look back at your roadmap deliverables over the trailing 12 months, like, do you feel like you shipped impact to customers as quickly as you wanted? And, sometimes in the moment when you're going through OKRs, it feels like you're checking off OKRs, but really it's like, do the customers feel the results of that work? And then, I think we also did a ton of pulse surveying and try to get qualitative data on like, how do engineers feel about tech strategy and vision and ability to move quickly? And, as you start seeing those numbers start to go down over time, like that starts to lead you to saying like, okay, we need to invest more in sort of stable foundations and have clear like ownership boundaries with business units. And that's what led us to partially to phase three.
That kind of answered the question that I was going to ask, which was around like how far you can go before some of the operations break down. And so I think like looking at how you were organizing more of the team oriented structure, like how far you could push that before you needed to start to structure more into business unit organization. Is there anything that else you would add around like how far you could push some of the models?
We talked about like pushing the phase one model as far as you can, like keeping the organization really flat. I think you can push it fairly far. I think at the time where you feel like this is getting painful, generally what we found is like you could still do that for another 6 months, right? If there's enough value that you're delivering to customers, everyone can live through a little bit of pain. It's not great, but if you're still able to keep your sort of core commitments and core requirements, but you're not shipping maybe the one or two like topmost asks, like generally found we could push that a little bit far, and it helped keep us really focused on quality and adding bank coverage. On phase two, I think we probably got this a little bit wrong. I would say I think we maybe pushed it slightly too far. Where one big thing, we had a big initiative to say like, okay, velocity is decreasing. We know this from our pulse surveys. Let's try to increase velocity, right? And so we had a big initiative around that in the company, and we trying to do that within the constraints of our team system. We found that to be really hard. So we ended up going in kind of surgically and saying like, oh, let's look at like, our delivery speed. Let's look at our CI/CD pipeline. Let's look at like how we're interfacing with different functions and different teams and make optimizations there. At the end of the day, it didn't make a huge difference in terms of velocity just because we were organized wrong, right? Teams still had a ton of dependencies. We didn't have the right platforms in place to allow teams to sort of self-serve support. And so I think at that point, we probably knew we were 6 to 12 months too late in making that change and making those investments. And so I'd say we, took our lessons of pushing the boundaries as long as we could, probably a little bit too far. And so, yeah, we probably got that slightly wrong.